The autumn grass on the Pontic steppe had gone dry and gold, and the morning air carried that particular stillness that comes just before something irreversible happens. A river ran through the plain, shallow, clear, blue-green over granite beds, and on both sides of it, two armies had been watching each other since dawn, each waiting for the other to make the first move that could not be taken back. On one bank stood the forces of the Golden Horde, the most feared military power the medieval world had ever produced, commanders who had inherited a century of unbroken dominance over this land. On the other, a Lithuanian army that had no business being this far south, led by a pagan Grand Duke who worshipped a thunder god and had never once knelt to any Khan. The Mongols had held Eastern Europe in submission for 120 years. Every prince, every city, every harvest had bent to their authority. And yet, on this particular morning in 1362, something felt different. A tension in the cold air that the veterans on both sides recognized without being able to name it. The sense that the world was about to turn on a moment neither side could fully control. What happened next changed Eastern Europe forever. Stay with me. Picture the southern Ukrainian steppe in the autumn of 1362. Not the Ukraine of cities and highways, but a landscape that has barely changed in 10,000 years. Flat grassland rolling out to every horizon, the sky enormous above it, the air carrying the first real chill of the season. The grass has gone dry and gold. A river cuts through the plain, shallow and clear, running blue-green over beds of granite. The locals call it the Sinuka, the Blue Waters. It is a quiet name for a quiet river, the kind of place that feels like it exists outside of time. It does not feel that way on this particular morning. On one side of that river, or somewhere near it, the exact site is lost to us, 3 Tatar commanders have gathered their forces. Their names, preserved in a Lithuanian chronicle written decades later, are Kutlubuga, Kadzi and Dimitro. They are the regional governors of Podolia, the men who run the Golden Horde's tribute collection apparatus in this part of the world. Between them, they command the cavalry of 3 separate administrative districts, and behind them stretches the authority of the most feared military empire that Europe and Asia had ever produced together. The Mongols had been collecting tribute from the princes of Rus for 120 years. 120 years. The grandfathers of the men standing in this field had never known a world without Mongol dominance. That is not a political fact. That is a psychological one. It shapes everything. On the other side, approaching from the north, is an army that has no business being here at all. It is led by Grand Duke Algirdas of Lithuania, a pagan. Not a lapsed Christian, not a man who had converted and fallen away. A genuine, committed worshipper of the Baltic thunder god Perkunas, in a Europe that considered paganism a relic of the barbaric past. The Byzantine Patriarch had excommunicated the Orthodox noblemen who served under him. The Teutonic Knights had spent generations trying to convert or destroy his people. And yet here he is, at the edge of the steppe, deep in territory that has been Tatar-controlled for longer than anyone alive can remember. His army is a strange thing by the standards of the age. Lithuanian cavalry, lightly armed and fast. Ruthenian infantry, foot soldiers from the Slavic principalities that Lithuania has absorbed. Men who have lived their entire lives in the shadow of Mongol power, who have watched relatives travel to the Horde's capital at Sarai to beg for the right to govern their own towns. And on the wings, crossbowmen from the town of Navakhrudak, commanded by Algirdas's 4 nephews, the sons of his brother Karyotas. The numbers are lost to us. The sources are thin, and honest historians admit that. But the territorial consequences of what happened here are not in dispute. Kiev, which had paid tribute to the Golden Horde since 1240, would stop paying after this day. Podolia would become a Lithuanian principality. The Black Sea coast would come within reach of a Baltic power for the first time. And the Golden Horde, already fracturing, already devouring itself in a catastrophic succession crisis, would take a blow in the west from which it would never fully recover. For the first time in history, a Western army marched deep into the Horde's own territory, met its forces in the open field, and broke them. The man who did it was a pagan from the forests of the Baltic, and almost nobody remembers his name. This is the Battle of Blue Waters, 1362, and it changed Eastern Europe forever. To understand what happened at Blue Waters, you need to understand what the Golden Horde actually was. Not the vague historical label, but the living reality of it in 1362. The Golden Horde was the westernmost piece of the Mongol Empire. Formerly called the Ulus of Yochi, it had been carved out in the 1240s after Batu Khan's armies swept through Russia, Poland and Hungary in a campaign of destruction so thorough that contemporaries genuinely believed the end of the world had arrived. Cities were burned to foundations, populations were massacred or enslaved. The principalities of Rus, Kiev, Vladimir, Ryazan, Chernigov, dozens of others, went from being functioning political entities to being tribute-paying vassals of a nomadic empire headquartered on the lower Volga. The mechanics of that tribute system are worth understanding because they are the thing that Algirdas is ultimately dismantling. Every Rus prince who wanted to rule his territory had to travel to the Horde's capital at Sarai, a city on the Volga that was, at its peak, one of the largest and wealthiest in the world, and receive a yarlik, a patent of authority, from the Khan. You did not rule by right, you ruled by permission. And if you stopped paying tribute, or if you attracted the Horde's displeasure, the army came. It always came, and it always won. The system reached its peak under Uzbeg Khan, who ruled from 1312 to 1341. He adopted Islam as the state religion, built mosques, maintained order on the trade routes, and kept the Russian princes in a state of permanent, organized submission. The Venetian traveller who visited Sarai in the 1330s described a city of extraordinary wealth, with separate quarters for Mongols, Alans, Kipchaks, Circassians, Russians and Greeks. It was cosmopolitan and powerful and utterly dominant in its corner of the world. That dominance radiated westward. In Podolia, the region between the Dniester and the southern Bug, the rolling upland that sits south of Volhynia and west of the Dnieper, the Horde maintained its authority through local governors called beys. These were men who commanded regional military forces, organized the collection of tribute from the Ruthenian and nomadic populations of the area, and represented Horde sovereignty at the furthest reaches of its western territory. Kutlubuga, Kaji and Dimitro were three such men. The Slavic name Dimitro for a Tatar commander tells you something about how thoroughly the Horde had integrated into the cultural landscape of this borderland. These were not foreign occupiers in a simple sense. They were part of a system that had been in place for over a century, as embedded in the life of the region as any other authority. And then, between 1357 and 1362, that system began to come apart at the seams. It started with a murder. Actually, it started with a series of murders. In 1357, Khan Jani Beg, a capable ruler who had led the Horde's armies as far as Tabriz in Persia, died on the road home. His son, Berdi Beg, took the throne and immediately began killing his brothers. 12 of them, by the count in the Russian chronicles. One was 8 months old. Berdi Beg reportedly killed the infant himself. This was not entirely unprecedented in Mongol succession politics. The scramble for power after a Khan's death was always brutal, but the scale of the purge was something new. By eliminating his male relatives so thoroughly, Berdi Beg effectively cut off the bloodline that would have provided legitimate successors after his own death. He had secured his throne. He had also planted a time bomb under the entire dynasty. In 1359, Berdi Beg was killed by his own brother, Kulpa. Kulpa lasted less than a year before he and his sons were killed by yet another brother, Nauruz. Nauruz died under suspicious circumstances after barely a year on the throne. A claimant named Khida seized power in 1360 with support from eastern factions of the Horde. He was dead by 1361. In the 20 years between 1359 and 1381, the period historians call the Great Troubles, or in Russian, Velikaya Zamyatnya, 25 different Khans would sit on the Golden Horde's throne. 25 in 20 years. The average reign was less than a year. The Batu dynasty, which had founded the Horde and maintained it for over a century, had gone extinct in a cascade of fratricide that Berdi Beg himself had made inevitable. Into this vacuum stepped Mamai, a military commander of enormous talent and ruthlessness who had one critical problem. He was not a Chinggisid. He was not a descendant of Genghis Khan. In Mongol political culture, only Chinggisids had the right to actually hold the throne of the Khan. So Mamai operated as a kingmaker and a warlord, setting up puppet Khans from whatever Chinggisid relatives he could find, ruling through them while maintaining actual military and political control himself. He was powerful, but he was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, managing internal rivals, maintaining his grip on the western steppe, dealing with eastern claimants to the throne. He could not be everywhere. And crucially, this is the detail that makes Blue Waters possible. The Crimean Ulus, the administrative district that controlled Podolia and the western Black Sea coast, was in the middle of its own campaign against the rival faction at New Sarai when Algirdas came south. The Podolian beys, Kutlubuga, Kajibe and Dimitro, could not call for reinforcements. Their superiors were busy. They were going to have to face whatever was coming with what they had. Now, a word about the sources, because they matter for how you understand everything that follows. The battle itself, the tactics, the formation, the sequence of events, comes primarily from a historian named Maciej Strajkowski, writing in 1582. That is 220 years after the event. The main chronicle source, the Tale of Podolia, was written in the 1430s as a piece of political propaganda supporting Lithuania's claim to Podolia in its dispute with Poland. The earliest mention of the battle in contemporary chronicles is a single sentence from the Rogosh Chronicle. That same fall, Algirdas laid waste to Blue Waters and the White Shore. One sentence. The territorial consequences of what happened are documented and not in dispute. The precise tactical details are a later reconstruction, produced by people with political reasons to make the story as dramatic and decisive as possible. We tell it as a battle because the evidence of its results demands that something significant happened here. But we hold the specific details with the appropriate amount of uncertainty. What we do know is the man at the center of it, Algirdas, Grand Duke of Lithuania since 1345, born around 1296 to the dynasty's founder, Gediminas. When news reached him in 1362 that the Lithuanian-aligned ruler of Kiev had died, a man named Theodore, Gediminas's own brother, and that the city was without clear leadership, Algirdas moved. Not immediately, not impulsively. He had spent years absorbing principalities through dynastic marriage, diplomatic pressure, and strategic patience. But he also understood military opportunity better than most rulers of his age. The horde was in chaos. The Crimean Ulus was distracted. The western Podolian bays were isolated. The window would not stay open indefinitely. He had been managing a two-front strategic situation for years. His brother Kęstutis held the western border, the long, brutal frontier war against the Teutonic Knights that had been grinding on for generations. That left Algirdas free to look east and south. And in 1362, south is where he looked. His army was unlike anything the standard narrative of medieval warfare would suggest. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was not a simple Baltic kingdom. By 1362, it was a genuinely multi-ethnic state. Its founding Lithuanian ethnic core already a minority in a realm that stretched across what is now Lithuania, Belarus, and significant parts of Ukraine. The Ruthenian nobles who served Algirdas kept their Orthodox faith, their legal traditions, and their local authority. The language of administration was Ruthenian, not Lithuanian. And the army that marched south in the autumn of 1362 reflected all of this. Lithuanian cavalry alongside Ruthenian infantry. A pagan Grand Duke commanding Orthodox foot soldiers. Crossbowmen from Navahrudak following the nephews of the man whose faith would have scandalized every church in Europe. Algirdas himself was a committed pagan to the end. When he died in 1377, he was burned on a ceremonial pyre with 18 horses and his possessions, in the old Baltic forest tradition. During his life, the Byzantine Patriarch described him as a fire-worshipping prince. He was excommunicated multiple times. He did not care. He did not need the blessing of Christendom to fight the horde. He needed cavalry, infantry, crossbowmen, and a plan. He had all four. The stakes in the autumn of 1362 operated at several levels simultaneously. At the personal level, Algirdas needed Kiev consolidated. A dead ally there had created a power vacuum that either Lithuania or the horde would fill. At the national level, the Podolian steppe and the routes to the Black Sea represented economic and strategic resources that could transform Lithuania's position in Eastern Europe. And at the civilizational level, though Algirdas himself would not have thought in those terms, the question was whether the system of Mongol dominance that had shaped Eastern Europe for 120 years would hold, or whether the cracks now running through the horde's political structure were deep enough to be exploited by someone with the nerve to try. The irony that sits at the center of this story is almost too perfect. The man who would deal the first significant blow against the horde in Europe was not a crusading king, not a Russian prince gathering Christian armies, not a defender of civilization endorsed by Pope or Patriarch. He was a pagan who burned horses at funerals and worshipped a thunder god. The chronicles of Christendom had no comfortable box to put him in, so they largely left him out. And for 6 centuries, the battle that changed Eastern Europe stayed in the footnotes. The campaign that ends at Blue Waters does not begin at Blue Waters. It begins weeks earlier to the northeast, with a Lithuanian army moving through territory that was supposed to be under horde control, and finding that the horde's grip had already loosened considerably. Algirdas's route south took him first to Korshev, an unidentified fortress on the Bystraya Sosna River, a tributary of the Don. The Bystraya Sosna runs through what was the easternmost fringe of the old Principality of Chernigov, territory that had been under Horde suzerainty for over a century, that had been paying tribute since the days when the Mongol Empire was still whole. Algirdas attacked it and took it. The chronicles note this matter-of-factly, because it was apparently not a significant fight. The Horde's administrative apparatus in the region had no capacity to resist. The Crimean Ulus, whose jurisdiction this fell under, was occupied elsewhere. Korshev fell, and the Lithuanian army kept moving. From there, the army pushed into the former Principality of Pereyaslavl, another old Rus state that had been reduced to a Horde tributary. Again, no significant resistance. The forces that should have been defending this territory were fighting each other on the lower Volga. Algirdas was walking through the ruins of an empire that had not yet noticed it was ruined. Then, in the autumn, the army turned west and crossed the Dnieper. This is the moment when the landscape changes, and the change matters both practically and psychologically. The route passed through the towns of Cherkasy and Kanyiv, Dnieper crossings that put the army at the transition between the forest-steppe corridor and the open Pontic steppe to the south. If you have only ever experienced the forests and river valleys of Lithuania and Belarus, the steppe is a genuinely different world. The trees thin out and then stop. The land opens up. The sky becomes something you have to reckon with rather than something glimpsed between branches. There is nowhere to hide. There is nowhere to set an ambush. Everything is visible for miles in every direction, and that visibility cuts both ways. For a Tatar cavalry army, the open steppe is home ground. It is the terrain their tactics were designed for, the landscape their horses had run across for generations. The composite bow is a weapon built for exactly this environment. Long sightlines, open approach corridors, room to maneuver and circle and feign retreat without running into forest or ravine. The Lithuanian army was moving south into conditions that theoretically favoured their enemy. Algirdas chose to do it anyway. That choice tells you something about how clearly he understood the situation. The Podolian Beys were not the full Horde army. They were regional administrators with regional forces. They were isolated. Fighting them in the open steppe was a calculated risk, not a reckless one. The Siniuka River runs for 111 kilometers, a left tributary of the southern Bug, draining a basin of almost 17,000 square kilometers. Its name, the Blue Waters, Sini Vody, comes from the granite outcrops along its bed that give the water a distinctive blue-green tint. This is the river that gives the battle its name. The town near the probable battle site was called Torhovitsia by the Slavic population and Yabgu by the Tatars. Yabgu meaning viceroy town, a name that tells you it was an administrative seat, the kind of place where tribute was collected and regional governance was organized. Its ruins have been tentatively identified near what is now the village of Torhovitsia in central Ukraine, in the Kirovohrad region. The terrain around the site is rolling steppe, not perfectly flat, but open. The Siniuka runs through it in a fairly straight course in this section. The river itself, shallow and narrow by the standards of the great Dnieper crossings, would not have been a major obstacle. But its presence matters for formation choices. A river at your back or flank is a constraint, and the decision to fight near it rather than away from it suggests that Algirdas had thought carefully about how the battle would unfold. This is the edge of the wild fields, the historical Polish and Lithuanian term for the broad, largely unpopulated Pontic steppe between the Dniester in the west and the Don in the east, north of the Black Sea. The wild fields was not empty exactly. Tatar nomadic groups moved through it seasonally, and there were scattered settlements at river crossings and administrative points. But it was genuinely sparse, genuinely lawless, in the sense that no stable political authority had claimed it in the European tradition. This was the nomadic world pressing up against the sedentary one. Algirdas had crossed that boundary deliberately. Now consider what he was facing. The three Podolian beys commanded forces drawn from their respective tamons, the Mongol administrative military unit that was nominally 10,000 men, but in practice whatever the regional levy could actually produce. In a period of severe internal horde crisis, with the Crimean Ulus fighting elsewhere and the central authority in Sarai changing hands every few months, the actual combat strength available to Kutlubuga, Haji Bey and Dimitro was certainly less than the nominal maximum. We cannot give you a number. Nobody who was there wrote one down in a form that survived. What we can say is that these were frontier forces, cavalry heavy, mobile, equipped for the steppe style of fighting that had made the Mongols terrifying for a century and a half. The core of any Tatar cavalry force in this period was the horse archer, mounted on the tough, enduring horses of the steppe, armed with the composite recurve bow. This was not a simple weapon. A Mongol composite bow was built from layers of horn, sinew and wood, shaped and dried over months, capable of generating enormous power in a relatively short length, essential for mounted use. It was accurate at ranges that European infantry weapons could not match. The arrows it fired could penetrate most contemporary armor at close range and could saturate a formation with fire at longer range. The standard tactical approach exploited this advantage mercilessly. Advance, release volleys of arrows, then, if the enemy advances, retreat, keeping the distance where the bow was effective, drawing the enemy out of formation into a pursuit, and then turning to encircle and destroy the disorganized pursuers. The feigned retreat was not a trick. It was a trained tactical maneuver that the Mongols had executed successfully against armies from China to Poland. The weakness in this system, and Algirdas clearly understood it, was what happened when it was denied the space it needed. The feigned retreat required room to retreat. The encirclement maneuver required open flanks. A tightly maintained formation that would not chase and that presented no exposed flank on its sides disrupted both. And crossbowmen, positioned on the wings of that formation, could punish the cavalry most severely at exactly the ranges where the Tatar archers' advantage diminished. The Lithuanian force was built around different principles. The cavalry was light rather than heavy, not the armoured knights of France or Germany, but fast horsemen on agile mounts, armed with spears, swords, and in some cases bows of their own. The infantry were Ruthenian foot soldiers, men carrying spears and shields, trained to hold a line, drawn from principalities where infantry warfare had a long tradition. They were not professional soldiers in a modern sense, but they were experienced in the kind of grinding, close combat that characterized infantry battles, and they were fighting under commanders they knew, in a formation that had been chosen for the specific circumstances they were going to face. The crossbowmen from Novorudak deserve particular attention, because they are the tactical detail most specifically recorded in the later sources. The crossbow was a fundamentally different weapon from the composite bow. It was slower. A trained crossbowman could lose 2 or 3 bolts per minute compared to the 6 or more arrows a skilled horse archer could fire. but it was far more powerful at closer ranges and required significantly less training to use effectively. A crossbow bolt from the type of weapon in use in the mid-14th century could penetrate the light lamella or leather armor that most Tatar cavalry wore. The rate of fire disadvantage mattered less in a formation engagement, where the crossbowmen were protected by the spearmen in front of them and were firing at close-range targets rather than engaging in a long-range archery duel. The formation Algirdas chose, as described by Strykovsky, with all the caveats about that source that we have already noted, was 6 groups arranged in a half-circle, a convex arc facing the Tatar line. Understanding why this was clever requires understanding what the Tatar cavalry needed to do to win. They needed to use their arrow fire to disorder the Lithuanian line. They needed the Lithuanians to either stand still and absorb that fire until they broke, or advance and pursue, leaving their flanks exposed. The half-circle complicated both options. Its angled wings, curving back toward the enemy, reduced the flat flank exposure that made encirclement possible. The crossbowmen placed on those wings could fire inward as the Tatars tried to maneuver around the sides of the formation. And the infantry mass at the center, dense, disciplined, protected by shields, could absorb arrow fire more effectively than cavalry, and then advance once the Tatars had been drawn close enough for the spears to be effective. It was not an improvised plan. Algirdas had been fighting wars against the Teutonic Order, against Moscow, against various Rus principalities for 17 years. He understood how to read terrain, how to compose a force for a specific objective, how to deny an enemy the conditions they needed to win. The half-circle formation at Blue Waters is the product of a military mind that had studied the Tatar way of fighting and had thought carefully about how to break it. The night before the battle, and here we acknowledge that we are filling in what the sources do not explicitly give us, while staying grounded in what we know about this army and this place, the Lithuanian camp sat somewhere on the southern steppe, probably close to the Siniuka, in the open ground near Torovitsia. There were no forest edges to anchor on, no castle walls to shelter behind. The army camped on the same kind of ground that the Tatars lived and fought on. Cook fires burned in the autumn darkness. The horses, Lithuanian cavalry mounts, and the draft animals of the supply train stood at their pickets. Somewhere across the dark steppe, the fires of the Tatar camp would have been visible. Both sides knew what morning would bring. The Ruthenian infantry among the Lithuanian force would have had their own prayers, orthodox liturgy, the saints they had grown up with, the faith that had structured life in the Rus principalities for centuries. The Lithuanian and Baltic elements of the army had different rituals, different gods, different ways of committing themselves to what was coming. There was no unified religious ceremony for an army this diverse. What there was, almost certainly, was the practical liturgy of preparation, weapons checked, crossbow bolts counted and arranged for quick access, horses fed and watered at the Blue River, armor inspected for gaps and weak points, and the quiet conversations that soldiers have the night before a fight, about what they are going to do when it starts, about what they will do when it is over, about the people they left somewhere north of the Dnieper who do not know they are sleeping on a Tatar battlefield tonight. The 4 nephews, Alexander, Yuri, Konstantin, and Fyodor Koryatovich, led the crossbow units from Novorudak. Their father, Karyjotas, had been Duke of Novorudak, one of the senior Lithuanian princes of his generation. He had died recently, between 1358 and 1363. The sources disagree on exactly when, but probably not long before this campaign. These four brothers were fighting under their uncle's command in a land they had never seen before, against an enemy their father's generation had watched terrorize the world. What they made of that situation we cannot say. What we know is what they did when morning came. The morning breaks clear. Autumn on the Pontic steppe is often the finest weather of the year. The brutal summer heat has lifted, the winter storms have not yet arrived, and the days open cold and sharp and bright. The Sinuka catches the early light and reflects it in the blue-green colour that gives it its name. The Lithuanian force deploys first, or nearly first. The sources suggest Algirdas chose his ground and his formation before the Tatars made contact. 6 units arranged in the half-circle. The Ruthenian infantry in the centre, spears and shields forward. The Lithuanian cavalry positioned where they can exploit whatever opening the battle creates. The crossbowmen of Navarudak on the wings of the arc, where they can fire inward across the formation's front and catch cavalry trying to work around the sides. The sons of Karyotis commanding those wings. The Tatar force deploys opposite. 3 commanders, 3 contingents, cavalry heavy, the composite bows already strung and accessible. They have done this before, many times. The script has always been the same. You advance, you release arrows. The enemy either stands and is eroded, or charges and is drawn out and encircled. The script has worked against Russian princes, against Polish knights, against Hungarian armies, against every kind of enemy the Horde has ever faced in the Western theatre. There is no particular reason to think it will not work against Lithuanians. The first phase of the battle begins with the Tatars advancing. The sound of a large cavalry force in motion on open ground is not subtle. Thousands of hooves on dry steppe grass produce a rolling thunder that you feel in your chest before you hear it clearly. The dust rises in the crisp autumn air. The Lithuanian line watches the approach and holds the formation. The arc does not move. The arrow fire begins before contact. This is how steppe cavalry fought. The Tatar horsemen ride along the face of the Lithuanian formation and release volleys, angling to hit the sides of the arc where the formation curves back. This is the classic approach. Saturate the flanks with fire, find the men who cannot quite get their shields up in time, create gaps, create fear. Watch the formation start to move, usually backward, usually in a panic, and then the pursuit begins and everything comes apart. The arrows hit. Men fall. The Lithuanian line takes casualties. This is not a clean battle where the clever formation simply neutralizes the enemy without cost. Arrow volleys at this range, against men with shields and whatever armor they carry, still find gaps. The wings of the arc absorb fire from the Tatar riders running along them. There is pain here, and death, and the natural human instinct to move away from the thing that is killing you. The arc holds. This is the first moment of significance. The Tatar commanders are running their standard script, and the script is not producing the expected result. The formation is not fragmenting. The men in it are not running. They are standing in their half-circle and taking the fire and not breaking. For a Tatar cavalry force, this is unusual. The sight of an enemy formation absorbing arrow fire and holding position is not something they encounter every day. By mid-morning, the arrow fire has been going on for some time, and the Tatar horses have been ridden back and forth along the Lithuanian front repeatedly. The crossbowmen on the wings of the arc have been responding. The crossbow's slower rate of fire is a real disadvantage here. 2 or 3 bolts per minute against the 6 or more arrows a skilled horse archer can release. But the bolts are penetrating the light armour of the Tatar riders at the ranges the battle has closed to. Horses are hit. Riders are hit. The light leather and lamellar armour that serves perfectly well at longer archery ranges offers substantially less protection against a crossbow bolt at close range. The Tatar commanders have a problem. Their primary weapon, the harassment arrow fire designed to disorder and frighten the enemy into movement, is not working as planned. The formation is holding. The ark's angled wings are not presenting clean, flat flanks to ride along, and the crossbowmen on those wings are extracting a cost that compounds with every pass. Every circuit of the Lithuanian formation that a Tatar rider makes is another opportunity for a crossbow bolt to find a gap. The option of the feigned retreat is considered, or at least it is the option that the military logic of the situation would have suggested. Pull back, invite the Lithuanians to pursue, then turn and encircle them in the open steppe. The problem is that the formation is not chasing. Algirdas is holding his men in the arc. The infantry do not move forward. The cavalry do not charge. The arc simply sits there, takes the fire, responds with crossbow bolts, and waits. The feigned retreat only works if the enemy follows. They are not following. By midday, the arithmetic of the situation has begun to shift. The Tatar forces have been taking crossbow fire for hours. They have not achieved the disorder in the Lithuanian line that would make the decisive encirclement possible. The three bays face a choice that has no good options. Continue the harassment fire that is costing them losses without achieving results. Attempt a direct assault on the formation, or disengage and withdraw. Disengagement at this point would mean abandoning Podolia and the entire tribute apparatus without a fight. That is not an option for men who represent the Horde's authority in the region. They choose the assault. This is the turning point of the battle, and it is worth spending a moment on why it was such a significant decision. A direct cavalry assault on a formed infantry line protected by crossbowmen was not the Mongol way of war. The Mongol tactical system had been designed specifically to avoid this kind of engagement, to never fight on terms that favoured the enemy's strengths. The composite bow was developed precisely so that cavalry did not have to close with infantry. But the Lithuanian formation has denied them the alternatives. The Tatars are going to ride directly into a line of spears. The charge comes from across the open ground, thousands of horsemen accelerating toward the centre of the arc. The ground shakes. The dust rises again, thicker this time. The Lithuanian infantry in the centre brace their spears, shields up, the front rank kneeling with spear butts in the earth to catch the weight of the horses. The noise is tremendous. The thunder of the cavalry charge, the shouted commands in Lithuanian and Ruthenian, the whistling of crossbow bolts from both wings as the Karyota's son's men open fire into the flanks of the advancing mass. The Tatar cavalry hits the Lithuanian centre. The moment of impact is chaos in the way that all such moments are chaos. Noise and violence, and the immediate dissolution of any sense of the overall picture into a few meters of immediate physical struggle. Horses screaming as they hit the spear points. Men on both sides going down. The pushing and shoving and stabbing that infantry combat at close range actually consists of, stripped of all the heroic language that sources tend to apply to it afterward. The Ruthenian foot soldiers in the Lithuanian centre were fighting men from principalities that had spent a century under Mongol dominance. Some of them would have grown up knowing Tatars as the ultimate authority, the power that no one questioned. They were standing their ground against that power now, with spears and shields, and the knowledge that the formation behind them was still intact, that the wings were still holding, that this was a situation that had been planned for. And from both wings, the crossbowmen were firing. This is the mechanism that the half-circle was designed to create. The Tatar cavalry has committed to engaging the centre. They are packed together in the press against the Lithuanian spear line. The wings of the arc, the Karyota's sons' crossbowmen, and the cavalry on the flanks are not engaged in that fight. They are free to fire inward, across the face of the arc, into the sides of the Tatar mass. At the ranges involved, tens of meters, not hundreds, the crossbow bolts are going through armour. The Tatars in the centre cannot easily respond to flanking fire when they are already engaged with the spear line in front of them. They cannot retreat easily because the press of their own cavalry coming from behind is pushing them forward. They cannot manoeuvre because the formation they are fighting does not have exposed flanks to go around. The arc is becoming an enclosure. Hours have passed since the battle began. The autumn sun has moved across that enormous steppe sky, and the fight at the centre of the Lithuanian arc has been grinding on. Not the clean, decisive shock of a successful cavalry charge, but the sustained, exhausting, brutal close combat that happens when a charge does not break the line it hits. The Tatar cavalry's great advantage, mobility, has been neutralized by the press of bodies. They cannot use their bows effectively at the range the battle has closed to. They cannot maneuver. They are fighting the kind of fight that the Lithuanian infantry was designed to fight, while being shot at from both sides by crossbowmen they cannot reach. Then the 3 bays fall. The chronicle says they fell in battle. All 3 of them, Kutlubuga, Kajibe, and Dimitro, killed in the fighting. Whether they were struck down in the press of the assault, whether they made a conspicuous charge and were targeted, whether they died in the collapse that followed rather than the assault itself, we cannot know. What we know is the effect. 3 commanders, dead, in a force that was already straining under the pressure of a battle it was not winning. The loss of all 3 commanders at or near the same time was catastrophic for command cohesion. The units that had been coordinating their movements under those 3 bays no longer had anyone telling them what to do. The tactical picture, already bad, became unmanageable. The collapse comes the way military collapses always come, not as a single moment, but as a cascade. One unit on the Tatar flanks sees the crossbow fire intensifying and the centre not breaking through, and the commanders apparently down, and it breaks, turns its horses and runs. Another unit sees the first one running, and the instinct to survive overrides the instinct to hold. Then another. Then it is not a retreat, it is a rout. Thousands of mounted men on fast horses accelerating away from the battle across the open steppe, heading south and east toward the Crimea or the Volga, anywhere away from the half-circle that has just swallowed their army's coherence. The Lithuanian line moves. This is the moment when the held-back cavalry is released. The infantry has done its work, held the centre, absorbed the assault, maintained the formation through everything the Tatar archers could throw at it. Now the fast Lithuanian horsemen go after the routing Tatars across the same open steppe that had theoretically favoured the Mongol style of warfare. The irony is precise. The steppe that was supposed to give the Tatars room to manoeuvre is now the killing ground through which they are being hunted. The pursuit stretches across the afternoon. The steppe is enormous, and the horsemen scatter in multiple directions. The Lithuanian cavalry cannot catch everyone, and does not try to. The objective is not total annihilation, but total control, eliminating any coherent Tatar force that might regroup and contest the territory. The chronicle's language is territorial. Some Tatars were driven to the Volga, others to the Crimea. That is not precise tactical reporting. It is a statement of what the battle achieved in geographic terms. The Golden Horde's authority west of the Dnieper had just been shattered, and the men who had exercised it were either dead or running. Torhovitsia, Yabgu, the viceroy town, falls in the battle's aftermath. The administrative apparatus that Kutlubuga, Haji Bey and Dimitro had maintained there, the local enforcement mechanism of the Horde's tribute system, is dismantled in a matter of hours. There is no one left to defend it. The tribute collectors, the record keepers, the soldiers who enforced the tamga, the Mongol tax, have scattered with the rest. The blue waters flow on through the autumn afternoon, unchanged and blue-green over their granite beds, as the Lithuanian army controls the ground around them. The steppe, which had been Tatar land for as long as anyone alive could remember, is Lithuanian land now. Or it will be, if Algirdas moves quickly enough to make it permanent. And he will. Evening comes to the steppe at the end of a very long day. The cook fires are lit again in a different arrangement than the night before, because there are gaps in the ranks where men were standing this morning. The horses are fed and watered. The wounded are tended, or not tended well enough, and some of them will die overnight in the autumn cold. The crossbow bolts that survived the battle are collected. The weapons of the dead are gathered. The 4 Karyotas brothers, Alexander, Yuri, Konstantin, Fyodor, walk the ground that is now theirs to govern. They are looking at it the way men look at land they are going to build on. Tomorrow, Algirdas will send riders to Kiev. His son Vladimir needs to know he is going there. The principality that has paid tribute to the Horde for 120 years is going to stop. The battlefield around the Siniuka River in the days after the fighting is what every medieval battlefield becomes in the hours after the fighting stops. A landscape of consequence. The open steppe, which offered the 2 armies such clean sightlines and such terrible exposure during the battle, now shows everything. The dead horses, the abandoned equipment, the detritus of a cavalry force that broke and ran. The Tatars who died in the assault on the Lithuanian centre lie where they fell, in the compressed ground where the arc's spear line had stood. The men who died in the crossbow fire on the flanks are scattered more widely. There are no reliable casualty figures for Blue Waters, not for the Lithuanian side, not for the Tatar side. The chronicles that mention the battle are interested in territorial consequences, not body counts. The tale of Podolia records that 3 Tatar princes fell in battle, Kutlubuga, Haji Bey and Dimitro, and that their forces were defeated. That is the specific human cost the sources preserve for us. Everything else is inference. A battle that resulted in the complete rout of a combined 3-district Tatar force, with all 3 commanders dead, was not a minor skirmish. The losses on the Tatar side would have been substantial, particularly in the pursuit phase, when routing cavalry on open ground is most vulnerable. The Lithuanian side took arrow fire for hours and held a direct cavalry assault. There were certainly significant losses there too, though the victory suggests they were manageable. What Algirdas did in the days immediately following the battle matters as much as the battle itself, because this is where the military victory becomes a political transformation. The most important immediate decision was Kiev. Vladimir Olgerdovich, Algirdas's son, was sent to Kiev as Grand Prince. This installed a member of the Gediminid dynasty, Algirdas's own bloodline, as the ruler of a city that had been under Mongol suzerainty since 1240. The tribute that Kiev had been paying to the Horde, the tax that every inhabitant of the principality had contributed to generation after generation as a matter of simple survival, stopped. The Chronicle records this directly. Algirdas put a stop to the payment of tribute to the Tatars. That sentence, in the context of 120 years of continuous payment, is remarkable. It is not a political statement or a diplomatic gesture. It is an economic and social revolution expressed in one act. Podolia was handled differently, and the handling tells you something about how Algirdas governed. He did not take Podolia as a personal possession or install a son there. He gave it to the 4 Karyotas brothers, Alexander, Yuri, Constantine, and Fyodor, his nephews, the commanders of the crossbow units that had played a central role in the battle's outcome. This was a reward, and it was also smart politics. The Koryatovich brothers had local credibility from their role in the campaign. They would govern Podolia with the investment of men who owned the place, not the detachment of administrators. Within a year, by agreement among the brothers, the Principality of Podolia was established as a formal entity. Yuri held Kamianets, Konstantin held Smotrich. The others received their own territories. And then they started building castles. This detail carries an enormous amount of meaning that can be easily missed. The Golden Horde had explicitly forbidden its subject territories from fortifying their cities. Walls and castles represented organized military resistance, the kind of thing a subject population was not supposed to have. For 120 years, the towns of Podolia had existed without stone defences, deliberately vulnerable to the punitive raids that the Horde used to maintain discipline. The Karyotas brothers began building Bokota Castle and Kamianets Castle almost immediately after taking control. The act of construction was a declaration. It said, "This land has a sovereign now, who can build walls, and that sovereign is not the Horde." The Horde's response, or rather its near total absence of a coherent response, tells you everything about the state of the institution in 1362. Mamai, the dominant warlord of the Western Steppe, did not counterattack. The Crimean Ulus, still tangled in its own conflicts, did not send an army to recover Podolia. There were no punitive raids, no diplomatic demands, no large-scale military response to what was, from the Horde's perspective, the loss of an entire administrative region. The institution that had maintained its authority through consistent, overwhelming force for over a century was too internally fractured to project that force when it was needed. Some historians, particularly the Ukrainian scholar Olena Rusina, have argued that the relationship between Algirdas and Mamai's Tatar faction was actually more cooperative than adversarial at this period, that an informal understanding between them may have been one of the factors that enabled the Lithuanian expansion. This is contested, and the evidence is thin. What is not contested is the result. Podolia stayed Lithuanian. Kiev stayed Lithuanian. The occasional tribute payment would occur in subsequent years out of pragmatic diplomacy rather than enforced submission, but the structural relationship between the Golden Horde and the Western Rus territories had fundamentally changed. Lithuania now touched the Black Sea. That geographic fact, which sounds almost abstract, was actually transformative. The trade routes that ran from the Baltic to the Black Sea could now run through Lithuanian territory rather than around it. The steppe corridor that had been a Mongol highway became a Lithuanian frontier. The cities of Podolia, rebuilt and fortified by the Karajotas brothers, became anchors of settled authority in a landscape that had been nomadic range. And in Kiev, for the first time since 1240, a grand prince ruled who paid tribute to no one. The immediate strategic consequences of Blue Waters were enormous, though they unfolded over years rather than weeks, and the full scope of what Algirdas had set in motion only became clear across decades. Lithuania, already the largest state in Eastern Europe, grew larger still. By the end of Algirdas's reign in 1377, he died at roughly 80 years old, which was extraordinary for a man who had spent his life at war. The Grand Duchy stretched from the Baltic coast in the north to the Black Sea in the south. It was, by area, the largest state in Europe. Not France, not the Holy Roman Empire, not the Kingdom of Poland. Lithuania, the pagan duchy from the forests of the Baltic, which had absorbed the Ruthenian principalities and pushed the Horde east of the Dnieper, and now controlled a territorial arc that would have seemed impossible a century before. The Union of Krevor in 1385, when Algirdas's son Jogaila married the Polish queen and accepted Christianity, was built on the foundation of what Blue Waters had made possible. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that emerged from that union, the largest political entity in Europe for 2 centuries, existed because Lithuania had the confidence and the territory to negotiate as an equal partner with Poland. Blue Waters was not the only battle that produced that confidence, but it was among the first and most decisive of them. For the Rus principalities, the battle's psychological effect was perhaps as significant as its territorial one. The system of Mongol dominance had persisted for so long, partly because of the genuine terror that the Horde's reputation inspired, the knowledge that resistance was futile, that the army always came, that no force in the Western world could stand against it in the open field. Blue Waters cracked that knowledge, not permanently, not on its own, but it demonstrated that a disciplined army with the right tactics and the right understanding of the enemy's weaknesses could defeat Tatar cavalry even on the steppe. 18 years later, in 1380, Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow would beat Mamai's forces at the Battle of Kulikovo, the victory that Russian history celebrates as the beginning of the end of the Tatar yoke. Kulikovo is better remembered. It is not the first. The battle that the history books mostly ignored had already proven that the Horde could be beaten. Blue Waters came first. The reason for that forgetting is itself historically instructive. Russian historians writing in subsequent centuries were invested in the narrative of Kulikovo, a Russian victory, a Christian victory, a Muscovite victory, that fit cleanly into the story of Russian national identity as they wanted to tell it. Lithuanian pagans defeating the Horde in 1362 did not fit that narrative. Polish historians, for their part, had their own reasons to minimize Lithuanian claims. Podolia was contested between Lithuania and Poland for decades after the battle, and a narrative emphasizing that Lithuania had won it by right of conquest was not something Polish chroniclers were eager to amplify. Jan Długosz, the great Polish historian of the 15th century, did not mention Blue Waters at all. The battle fell into a gap between national historiographies, too Lithuanian for Russia, too inconvenient for Poland. It was not until the 20th century that serious scholarly attention began to focus on Blue Waters. Polish historian Stefan Kuczynski published a dedicated study in 1965. Lithuanian scholar Romas Batura produced an extensive account in 1975. Ukrainian historians held conferences in 1997 and 1998 dedicated specifically to the battle and its problems of localization and source analysis. The 650th anniversary in 2012 prompted an academic conference at Vytautas Magnus University in Lithuania. In 2022, the National Bank of Belarus issued a commemorative coin with Algirdas's portrait. Slowly, in the way that marginalized history usually resurfaces, through scholarship, through national identity projects, through the gradual accumulation of interest, the Battle of Blue Waters has been reclaiming the attention it deserved all along. What endures about this story, beyond the tactical detail and the political consequence, is the strangeness of it. The man who first broke the Horde's power in Europe was not a crusader. He was not defending Christianity. He was not even, by the standards of his age, a recognized member of the civilized world. He was a pagan who burned horses at funerals, who was excommunicated by the church whose lands he was effectively protecting, who ruled a state that medieval Europe had called the spawn of Satan for its refusal to convert. The categories that the age used to understand history had no place for him. And so history, for a long time, left him out. Centuries later, the Sinyuka River still flows through the steppe of central Ukraine, still runs blue-green over its granite bed. The town of Torhovitsia still exists, though most of the people living there today probably could not tell you what Yabgu meant or who fought near its river crossing in the autumn of 1362. The steppe is farmland now, wheat and sunflowers where the Tatar and Lithuanian cavalry maneuvered, roads and villages where there was once only open grassland running to every horizon. There is no monument on the exact site of the battle. We are not entirely sure where the exact site was. But somewhere on that ground, in October of 1362, a pagan Grand Duke from the forests of the Baltic looked at the most feared military machine in the world, understood precisely what it needed to function, denied it those conditions, and broke it. The Horde had broken cities, toppled kingdoms, and bent the arc of history for 130 years with fire and arrows. At Blue Waters, for the first time, the arc bent back. So that's the story, and if you've made it all the way here, something in it must have landed for you. And I think I know what it is. Because this wasn't really just a battle. It was about a man who refused to wait for permission. Permission from the church, from history, from the idea of what a legitimate ruler was supposed to look like. And moved anyway, with what he had when the window was open. Algirdas didn't have the right religion, the right endorsement, or the right reputation. He had clarity, patience, and the willingness to act while everyone else was still arguing about who deserved to. There's something the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote that keeps coming back to me here. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Algirdas couldn't control the Horde's chaos. He could only control his response to it, and he responded with everything he had. That's the thing worth carrying with you. Your moment of open window might not look like an army or a steppe, but it's there. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs it today. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.